Okay, last time I was finishing up on this whole issue of sort of individualism and the idea that individuals contribute to the success, or I suppose, or failure of the group, i.e., the clan, the family. And you see this probably most strikingly in the whole issue of status. Education in Asia really doesn't have much in common with contemporary attitudes of education in the United States. In the period of time I've been teaching for over 30 years, education in the United States, maybe back when I was an undergraduate in the 70s, was somewhat similar to sort of what you have in Asia, with the idea that education, getting a degree, getting a bachelor's degree, or even better, getting an advanced degree like a master's or doctorate, had status and prestige attached to it, regardless of what the discipline was you got it in. But by the 1980s, and certainly by the 1990s in the United States, what happened is, and and you could see this even in elementary school education. There was a whole hype by the feds and everyone else that if you got a college degree, you were going to make X amount more per year. In other words, you were worth more money, and so they basically monetized education. And that's sort of the extreme of that would be what you see in the 21st century now, where most universities, Chaminade being a good example, basically their revenue stream is almost entirely defined by degree programs which guarantee you a job. So they're what used to be called professional, or workplace designed programs, which is one reason why this class isn't being taught, as part of the normal curriculum at Chaminade anymore, because it doesn't fit into any professional programs per se. That was a very popular class when we were, more of a class of what they call liberal arts institution, of which there are very few left in the United States, as far as I know. And so what happened was in the United States, the monetization, I would argue, went to extremes, with the idea that, in fact, there were a bunch in the 90s and early 2000s, there were a number of folks that actually sued universities when they got their degree and they didn't get as much money as they had been told they would, or yeah, whatever. Which strikes me as being both incredibly naive and also pretty silly, but that's beside the point. But nonetheless, what happened is degrees now don't mean anything. Having a doctorate doesn't give you any prestige or status in the community. So, getting a degree now, since having degrees doesn't give you any status, then I suppose to a certain extent, logically, then the only reason to get a degree would be because of, professional certification. So, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, I guess. In Asia, that's never been the case. In Asia, and I think back with that image I gave you last time of the guy with the water writing the poetry in the walkway or the promenade in Beijing. In Asia, traditionally, always, well, I should say since the first emperor, what happened was that education was seen as status just by virtue of being educated. And all through Chinese history, think of someone like Confucius, for example, or Zhuangzi. He's actually never has a real job. He's a consultant, but a large part of his life, he wasn't. He didn't even have it. He wasn't even a consultant. He just hung around. And people that had money and status would hire him to hang around and sort of be there, because sort of by osmosis, then they became more educated because they had this educated guy there. This is actually pretty typical in what you find, not so much in the Roman period, but certainly in classical Greece, where education was seen as its own status and prestige, regardless of what you were educated in. So the idea that education had to have a practical aspect wasn't part of classical Greece, and it wasn't and still isn't part of modern education systems in Asia. That's not to say that people don't get practical degrees, but it does mean that getting a practical degree is not seen as an access to better jobs necessarily, but it certainly doesn't give you more access to prestige and status than someone who gets a degree in some of say calligraphy or Chinese poetry or something like that. They have just as much status as you do. And if they have advanced degrees, then even more so. So the system that we've seen in the last, 40, 50 years in the United States never has, well, to this date, hasn't happened in Asia. And to be honest, I don't think it's going to. I think the American system, as we're already seeing with AI and everything else, the American system is a very fragile logic. There is no particular relationship between degrees and salary, or even job position. At some point, that has to be based on competency, and that's not competency and knowledge. That's competency and thought process. So, I think the American thing is who knows where it's going to go next. But I think that's one reason why many folks are having second thoughts about getting degrees, advanced degrees, whether bachelor's, master's, whatever. Just because it's pretty clear there isn't despite the rhetoric of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there is no clear relationship between the more educated you are, the more money you make. And why, I've never understood why people thought that was the case. But then, my degrees are in anthropology, archaeology, and then in geography. So who am I to talk? So anyways, so in the Chinese system, education, regardless of what it was in, was the key structure of success, both personally and collectively. For the family, it was prestige. And you can see this, I know with my in-laws, but certainly with my friends, and even in Hawaii that are Hawaiian Chinese, that the kids getting degrees, the classic stereotype would be the oldest son gets a business degree and takes over the family business. The second son becomes a doctor. The third son becomes a lawyer. And I actually know a fair number of families where this is exactly the case. The kids from the time they were in elementary school are pretty much told, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a doctor. And the combination of the fact that the family makes decisions about individuals, but also that individuals will strive their utmost to perform to the family expectations, means that happens. And in sort of classic Anglo-American society, you tell your 7-year-old kid they're going to be a lawyer, good luck on that one. You're just, as far as I'm concerned, just wasting your time and theirs. So education is status. Where education is different than as we'll see in Japan. Education in China is stunningly competitive. And on the other hand, what you find is Chinese, even if they're in the same institution, I've seen this with the guys we work with at Northwest University, even the students in the same institution don't see themselves as a group. This is very different, as we'll see when we get to Japan, where once you get into a university, it sort of becomes like a party school. And everyone, one of the main reasons people go there would be to the social network of their classmates becomes the key part of their professional life for the rest of their professional career. In fact, even beyond their career. Nothing like that in China. Chinese are hyper competitive. And so if you go into a Chinese classroom, you can actually feel this. I mean, we gave talks in a couple of Chinese classes. And when the students come into the classroom, they're sort of eyeballing, it's like in the middle of the semester, they're sort of eyeballing each other because as far as they're concerned, there's only one person that's going to get an A. Maybe two people are going to get Bs. And they're all sort of, it's like being in the Olympics. It's like, I'm not going to be second place. I'm not going to be third place. And so they're eyeballing their classmates as competition. They're not eyeballing them as friends or, fellow sufferers or whatever it might be. They might get a little bit of that, but the reality of it is everyone's in it for themselves because, of course, their main link and loyalty is to the family who isn't at school with them. And the Chinese system is explicitly competitive. Teachers go to pretty great lengths to make it really clear where you fit in a classroom. And not surprisingly, China has one of the highest suicide rates in the world when it comes to students, especially undergraduate, but actually also in high school, not quite as bad as Japan, but really up there. And you also end up with a whole set of interesting behavioral side effects, which is students that basically sort of opt out of society. The Japanese term is hikikomori, which is basically folks that no longer they're sort of taking up oxygen, but they don't go out of their room. They don't do this, they don't do that. Chinese, I would argue, actually have more of that than the Japanese do. where people just sort of, they can't handle the stress, they can't handle the competition, so they're sort of saying, F this, I'm out of here. And they just sort of passively turn into lumps. And again, given the way that families work, you can have someone who's actually, dropped out of university, say for 2 or 3 years, and no one outside of the immediate family will actually know that because it's the family. If you ask members of the family, oh, what's so and so doing? It's like, oh, well, they're taking extended studies or something. They'll come up with some excuse, if you would, because basically that person just could not handle the competition. There's no link between, like I said at the beginning, there's no link between what you do at a university and the jobs you get. The folks that I deal with, the geography department's a little bit different, at least in Northwest, because that actually, like its counterparts, for example, the UH geography department, NOAA, is directly tied to jobs because there's an enormous, stunning demand for geographers. And that's not going to, no matter how far AI goes, I don't think that's going to change in the near or far future. Same sort of true in China. So geography is sort of one of my two disciplines is sort of an oddball because it's a liberal arts discipline, but it's hugely important in the world that we live in. Think of, GIS systems, Google Earth, et cetera, et cetera. The other one in anthropology, archaeology. Archaeology is a big discipline in China, but people go into it because they weren't competitive. When in China, as in all of Asia, when you test into university, you test into specific disciplines. So you don't get accepted at, say, UH Manoa or accepted at Chaminade University. You would get accepted to Chaminade University's education program. So it's very specific. So you take their test, and that's a unique test that's given by that department or that program or however they're set up. So, for example, the students in Northwest University in Xi'an that are in their archaeology program tested into that program. They weren't liberal arts students who decided to go into archaeology. They went into that directly. And interestingly enough, one of the reasons that's actually a popular program is one, it leads to decent government jobs. It's all the provinces and even the central government have a huge demand for archaeologists. But also because archaeology, unlike some other disciplines, involves a lot of bilingual education, either in Japanese or English. So for folks that actually want to be in business, they find degrees in archaeology are actually sort of a clever way to, get into, say, business programs, which are very difficult to get into in China, because they're directly tied to the Central Party, Communist Party. So business degree programs throughout most Chinese universities could almost be seen as Chinese Communist Party programs. So archaeology is an interesting program because a lot of the students there are pretty motivated, and they're good students, but their motivations are all across the board. But they're gonna bust ass against their classmates to be the best in the group. Now, what's really surreal about all this is again, this goes way back in Chinese history. It fluctuates on and off, but over the last 2,000 years, well, in fact, a little over that because the first emperor sets this up. And again, part of this was this idea that what he wanted to do, if you remember back a couple of presentations ago, what he wanted to do was supplant the idea that clans were the most important. So he comes up with the idea of the bureaucracy. Well, one of the problems you have with the bureaucracy is who do you put in it? If you just put members from clans in it, then you really haven't done anything. As we'll see, that's exactly what happened in Japan. That's why the Japanese bureaucracy is totally messed up, because it basically still is an old boy network. It's like the British system. In China, they intentionally don't do that. So what they have is what becomes very quickly called the civil service exams, and they had these right till the 1950s when the Communist Party comes into power. They initially stop the civil service exams. Then in the late 1960s, all the schools in China were closed. All of a sudden, they just arbitrarily got rid of all the schools. And I actually have some relatives whose parents were actually professors. And all of a sudden, one day, the Communist Party came into the university and basically said, you guys are out of work. Congratulations, we're shipping you off to a farm and you're going to be farmers. And for the next 15 years, they lived in these semi-prison gulags. And they were just basically surviving. If they didn't farm, they starved to death, and the party didn't care. So the party under the late Mao period decided that education in any form other than learning how to read the little red book, i.e. the Maoist doctrine, was irrelevant. So it's important to remember when you're talking to older Chinese that this is one of the reasons they don't talk about the Cultural Revolution, because from the late mid 1960s till 1976, there was no education in China. If people became literate, it was literally because the folks around them taught them how to read and write. And there was no education system, which, as far as I know, was unique in the world. I've never heard of any other thing like that. And it's so ironic given the fact that China put such huge emphasis on education right till the mid 60s. Mao dies, the system shifts, and then whoop, all of a sudden education comes back in. For example, my in-laws suddenly found that the university reopened, and the first thing it did is it chased them down and brought them back to the university and gave them their jobs back. But that's something that a lot of their friends and colleagues died. And especially this was true of secondary school and university, because the Communist Party just really had a thing on about getting rid of these people. And so it's you when you talk to people, if they went through that, they won't talk about it. It's just PTSD maxed out. So what happened was all of a sudden 1977, all of a sudden Wang, the schools start up again. And by the 1990s, within no more than 10 years, everything was back to the way it had been before, with one exception. You didn't have the centralized, uh, you know, compulsory, universal exam system that you'd had for the last 2,000 years in China. And so what happens is different universities do their own exams, and that's the system you still have today. The public examination system, the civil service exams that made China, even when the Europeans were interacting with the Chinese and saying, oh, they're so primitive, they're so this and all that, it still stunned them that in China anyone could take the civil service exam. And if you passed the civil service exam, you automatically got a job in the government. And that was the whole function of the civil service exam. That was how you filled the bureaucracy. And what you did is you had tiers of the exam. And you'd have sort of what you might call sort of like a general exam. If you passed that, you got into government. There was then a second tier exam. If you passed that, you got into a higher tier of government. If you passed into the imperial exam, which was actually given by the emperor at wherever the capital was at the time, then you automatically became a civil servant in the senior levels of government. So you'd have someone who might be in the early mid 20s who, suddenly passes the imperial exam, and they're now, 15, 20 ranks higher in the government than someone who's been in the government for 20 years. So there's no idea of seniority. It was based entirely on your educational scores, and your prowess in education. And even in the period when the Communist Party gutted everything, people never forgot that, because that's part of the Chinese value and the Chinese logic. And that's one reason why getting education is so absolutely central in Chinese society even today. Chinese over thousands of years have had it burned in behind their eyeballs that you have to be educated to be successful. You have to be educated to have status and prestige. There is no equivalent. This is true in all of Asia, but especially in China. Being worth lots of money and not being educated doesn't mean squat. It means everyone can run all over you. And if you go to parties or anything, people introduce you to you, like they're wealthy, and suddenly people start giggling. Some guy next to you who might not be worth anything might be living in his car, but if he's scored high on exams at the university and had his degree at the university, then he's worth, you might be worth millions. He's worth more than using status and prestige, and there's nothing you can do about that, I guess, unless you went back to school. The other part about this then is given the fact that you combine this on one hand with the fact that Chinese have a very strong attitude that, as I mentioned last time, that morality and ethics pretty much stop at the clan. Outside of the clan, morality and ethics really aren't an issue. It's more like getting caught is the issue. This is one reason why you always have the enormous problem. This is especially true in China, but apparently also in Korea. Cheating is just endemic. Because the people you're competing against aren't part of your family, so why would you have any ethical and moral rules about cheating? It's just the logical thing to do. In fact, people would think you're sort of nuts if you don't cheat. So what you find is a hyper competitive educational system, Um, this ties directly into the business system, not directly because in the private sector, to a certain extent, you're not going to hire folks based on their scores in school, what degrees they've got. Though you will, if you're anywhere from a mid-sized business or up, you'll make sure that you have at least a couple of people in sort of middle, higher level management that are well educated. And to a certain extent, they become your public relations department. They're the folks that PR everyone else because they're going to automatically have status and prestige outside of the company because they're well educated. So it's, I would argue in many ways, it's almost, if not the flip of the American system, it's entirely separate. I think I mentioned this a little bit last time, but just to reiterate, um, social networks are the key to getting by. Yeah, I did mention this last time. So what you find is social interaction is based on pecking order in Asia. This is true in most societies, but certainly true in Asia. And your position or your in the hierarchy is defined one by your education, two by your family name, and three by who you know. Now, as in Pacific Island society, certainly in Hawaiian society, what you find in Asian societies is the different types of reciprocity. And so I'm going to, for those of you that don't remember your intro anthro class or never took it, there's three types of reciprocity you're giving and receiving. The first is what we call generalized reciprocity. This would be people's relationships with, say, their parents, their siblings, their kids. The idea that no one keeps track or keeps book on how much you've done for your brother or your sister. It's who they are that's more important than what you've done or haven't done for them. I would argue this has been fading in American society to an enormous extent. That the network of people, if you ask people to honestly try to evaluate how many folks they're in generalized reciprocity relationship with, it might be their spouse and maybe one or two others, maybe their parents, but I'm not sure. In many cases, I want to do that, and maybe their kids, or maybe their kids till they're 18. I don't know, but it's certainly not something that's very large, and it's certainly not a large pocket of people for the classic Anglo-American system. In the Hawaiian system and the Asian systems, this would be your whole family. So everyone that you're in a family relationship identity with. So, for example, the members of the clan that you actually interact with on a regular basis, that would be generalized reciprocity. And this is true in my social situations. Is stuff moves around all the time. You can end up with a sofa, lose a TV. You can end up with a car. You can lose a car. Now, it didn't disappear. It just went to someone else in the family who the group or that individual asked for it. And it's like, okay, yeah, here, if you need it more than I do, then take it. There's not this idea of individual possession, which I was mentioning last time as one of the huge sort of marriage conflicts between Anglo-American values and Asian values, and also Hawaiian values. Which again, just as a note, this is one of the reasons why Hawaiians and Asians, specifically Chinese, tended to intermarry fairly frequently, especially in the 19th century, but even today, simply because their value systems are very similar in terms not only of having generalized reciprocity, but also the fairly large number of people and who those people are that you have it with. Now, the second tier of reciprocity is balanced reciprocity. And this is the idea that if I do you a favor, you owe me the equivalent back. Now, you don't try to return the same favor. It's the idea of equivalence. And so what you get with this, and again, this is how the chiefs operated, the Ari'i operated in Hawaii, especially in the monarchy period. But this is also how it functions in Asian societies. Giving is hugely important in Asian societies. My Chinese relatives are always consumed, especially at Chinese New Year's and stuff like that, with gift giving. What you give, who you give it to, how much you give. And this is based on they spend hours talking about this. This is something they take very, very seriously. What you're actually doing is, in a lot of cases, these are business gifts, I suppose, or people that you want to network with gifts. And the attitude is that what you do is you give someone something, and now they owe you. It's this idea of reciprocity balance. Think of it as scales. Now, what you want is to be in a situation where you've done things for people and they haven't paid it back yet. Because what that means is you end up it's like having a savings account. or insurance. So when you do need something, you've got a list of people you can go and say, hey, I'm sorry, I don't hate to bother you, but I need you to. And what you know is that basically will zero out that balance. So what you find is anybody in an Asian system spends an enormous amount of their time and effort trying to build up a list of folks that they've done favors for, with the idea that somewhere down the road in the future, they might not have to, but they want to be able to have that as like an insurance package they can call that favor on. This is called guanzi in the Chinese system. And this is the basis of Chinese business and to a certain extent social logic. If you're not dealing with family, the only folks that you can deal with in sort of a trustworthy fashion are the folks that you have these guanzi relationships with. And the real simple reason goes back to gossip. If I'm in a relationship with someone and they've done something for me and they want their favor returned and I say no, or I BS them and don't do it, then what they're going to do is they're going to start going off in the social media and saying, oh, Bordner, da, 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 I only asked him for this little favor. Did this big thing for me, a few years ago, and he wouldn't return it. And immediately my social credibility drops to zero. In fact, it probably goes to a negative. So the fear of not paying back what you accepted is one of the main ways that Chinese behave themselves. Now, what that means again is if you just, when I was mentioning earlier, you only have ethical relationships within the family. That's generalized morality. Outside of it, you don't have any relationships. So you can do anything you want to anybody. But if they're in a balanced reciprocity relationship with you, then you've got to trust each other because they did something for you and you owe them back and da 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 da. So the other reason that the balanced reciprocity becomes so important is that basically is the collection of folks that are to some extent dependable, that you can trust what they say to a certain extent, you can trust what they do because you're in this very complex relationship with Guanzi with them. Outside of that, all bets are off. And I mentioned this last time, is there's no ethics and morality with strangers. In fact, strangers in Asia would be the equivalent of strangers in one of those, 1960s, 70s Clint Eastwood westerns. The guy rides into town and immediately everyone starts shooting each other. Why? Because there's no, they're strangers. There's no morality there. To a certain extent, the stereotype of the Wild West, which is one reason why westerns are so popular in Asia, I think, is because the idea of the stranger just has this enormous resonance. That's called negative reciprocity, where there are no moral or social rules. It's sort of you do unto them before they do unto you, and you can do unto them whatever you want to. So there's these three levels of reciprocity: generalized, which means shared; balanced, which is exactly what it means; and then negative, which means screw them. And the function of Guanzi is to build up a network of folks that are in a balanced reciprocity relationship. Now, having said this gets an incredibly complex game that people play, especially in China, where you try to give favors to people who don't want to accept those favors because they don't want to be beholden to you. But then they have to be careful because, depending on how they do it, you can spin that you're just trying to be a generous person. They suddenly sort of flipped you off. And that gives them negative credibility, i.e. gossip. So this is a constant, huge nightmare that consumes an enormous amount of people's time, especially in China, but certainly also in Korea and Japan, but especially in China, with this idea of how you play out relationship. Now, especially in the last 10 years under Xi Jinping, what you find is that the Communist Party, on one hand, has become even more visibly, stunningly corrupt. And not surprisingly, the big reason for the corruption, if I'm in business or some other aspect of Chinese society, I'm going to make sure I give as many gifts to Chinese senior Communist Party members as I can, simply because I want those as insurance. So, for example, they recently got rid of about half of the senior generals and admirals in the Chinese military because they were all taking these enormous bribes. Well, at least a lot of these were from defense contractors who are basically paying these guys off so that they wouldn't look at too carefully at, say, quality control in the new jets or something like that. And that was everyone knew what that was about. but you didn't advertise it. But nonetheless, it was there. Um, that's the downside of Guanxi. Since there's no legal system in the American sense, that's sort of like a controlling factor. Then the only system of control is the basis of the IOUs. Um, Now, one of the things that was a huge part of Chinese society, actually off and on all over the last 2,000 years, but especially in the 20th century, early 21st century, was the fact that especially from the 1980s under Deng Zhou, under the Chinese post-Mao administration, when this idea of people getting ahead became really big. What you find is that given the limited resources, the Chinese government decided to focus on particular locations. So Shenzhen, which I showed you some images of, was a non-existent little farming town, which is now one of China's most successful, largest cities. Shanghai grows enormously in potential and importance for the same reason. Now, what that meant then is if you wanted to be successful, if you wanted to be ahead, or if you wanted to have connections with those folks, you had to move to those urban areas. So what happened is the rural areas in part got depopulated, but they got depopulated by a select audience, the folks, in the university age through 30s who had ambitions, wanted to be successful, or their family sent them off so the family could get the advantage, moved to these urban areas and became this enormous temporary migrant workforce. This is still a huge issue in all the main urban areas. If we go to, I'm most familiar with Xi'an. You go to some neighborhoods, you see these 30, 40-story high rises that are giant dorms. The companies actually build for their temporary migrant labor. Xi'an's famous for cell phones, for example. So, the company that makes cell phones will have these enormous dorms with a workforce that's, in most cases only been there maybe 18 months. They'll maybe stay 2 or 3 years, then they go back home, back to the farming country. Now, the advantage of that to the government, it meant the government could spend almost no money, time, and effort in the vast majority of the countryside of China and just focus their efforts on the urban areas, which also gave them more central control and central authority, which of course is hugely important in the Chinese state since it's a central authority state. One of the ways that they kept control is still the document that you have in China, which bad feeling the American government's trying to come up with a similar thing. And this is called a hukou. In China, everyone has it's halfway between a driver's license and a passport, but in many ways it actually functions more like a passport. And this is your hukou. Not only do you have this, but the government has this in their database. The government has everyone in China in their database from, I think, the time you're 3 years old. And by the time you're in elementary school, you already have at least the basic hukou. And the hukou is both a document, but also a set of data, which basically says everything from where you were born, where you live, where your residence is, where you're supposed to be working, everything, who your relatives are, who you're married to. I mean, everything, your grade, even your grades you got in school. I mean, don't mean in general, I mean, every grade you got in every class in school. Every discipline issue that you had, if you got some of us got in trouble in, say, high school, well, that would be in your hukou. Now, what companies did and still do, in fact, just this last couple of days ago, there was this huge coal explosion in China. And everyone that got killed, as far as I understand, were rural farmers who were temporary migrants working at that coal mine. And none of them were supposed to be there as far as the hukou was concerned. So as far as the government was concerned, they didn't know where these guys were. They thought they were back somewhere else, which means right now is the Chinese government's having this huge problem of, I don't know, it's 120, 90, it's at least 100 folks, I'm pretty sure, are dead in a mine explosion. And the government's having a hell of a hard time figuring out who they were because they weren't supposed to be there. They were all sort of, I suppose you might say it's like a version of an illegal migrant because they never told the government when they moved and got this job. They intentionally forgot to tell the government office and have that put into their hukou. And companies play this game all the time. Companies are constantly getting caught by, government officials or government agencies going into workplaces and asking people for their hukou and finding out they don't, one, either they don't have it with them, or two, they're not even supposed to be there. So it would be illegal immigration or illegal workplace stuff in the United States, which of course is a huge political issue right now. In China, that's with Chinese. So it's not China, it's not non-Chinese. It's Chinese who are in the wrong place. And what that almost invariably means is folks who are farmers who end up moving to the cities illegally, or without, yeah, it's without the support of government, so it's illegal. Now, interestingly, is what's happened is as China's moved more and more into AI, robotics, and stuff like that, is the demand for some areas of this labor has dropped. And also because the jobs, as the Chinese economy has gotten better, the pay scale in these non-hukou companies was so bad that people are just saying, screw this, I'm out of here. And they're going back to the farm. So what you're finding is more and more in the last 5 to 7 years is people actually leaving these illegal workplace situations and going back to their rural farming backgrounds because they've realized they can make as much if not more money back at home, and the conditions are generally better, and of course it means they're not trying to hide from the government, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the hukou is a huge thing. It's the main way the government controls the entire population in China. With access to the database, the central database, you could literally type in a name of everyone in China and find out where they are, how old they are, everything that you want to need to know about them, at least as much as you would have, say, on a social media, all your social media total. One of the other side effects of this is that if you're dealing with folks who you aren't part of the family with, which is most everyone, Chinese are tremendous risk takers. Chinese, I would argue, are, if not addicted to gambling, it's real close to being an addiction. And the odd thing about it is, unlike Americans, who I think now that I live in Nevada, it seems like people come to Nevada because Americans are convinced they're going to be lucky. Chinese don't really believe in luck. Again, going back to the marriage thing and numerology, Chinese believe that shit happens. So you might be lucky, but it's just as likely that's going to be rebounded by anti-luck or bad luck. On the other hand, one thing that's really common in China, I've never figured out exactly where it comes from. Maybe it has to do with this, idea of the central exam. But Chinese are firmly convinced that they're smarter and more successful than anyone else. Now, collectively, this would just be ethnocentrism. But what you find is within clans or within families or even individuals, they're firmly convinced that given an equal opportunity, they can be a better business person, or they can be a better that or better that, this or that than anyone else. So Chinese are tremendous risk takers. If you think about it, the Chinese that ended up in Hawaii in the 19th and 20th century, even down till today, the Chinese that migrate to Hawaii right now, are taking a staggering amount of risk. They're moving to a society they know nothing about. If anything, they know that the society doesn't really like them, doesn't support them, has dissed on them several times just in the last 50 years, is currently dissing on them right now. They have to learn another language, another system, and yet Chinese come over in huge numbers, move to other countries. By contrast, Americans don't do stuff. Americans aren't really risk takers. Chinese are. And one of the reasons for that, very simply, is the Chinese view of their own potential and their own capability is really high. I would argue in many cases is not warranted, but nonetheless, they have a stunning ability to think they can do X, Y, and Z, even if there's no evidence to support it. Now, what this means then is taking chances to get to that level of potential are entirely logical and legitimate. And to a certain extent, the family's not going to fight them as long as the family doesn't get drawn into some sort of nasty gossip. So going after your coworkers, doing nasty stuff at work to your coworkers, all this type of stuff is extremely common in China. You probably trust your coworkers less than your competition. As we'll see, this is the opposite in Japan, where loyalty to the company is a huge thing. I don't know if anyone in China would even conceive the idea of loyalty to the company. They sort of start laughing at you, I'm pretty sure. So what you get is this Chinese have a very strong attitude that winning is everything. Because you have to remember, if you win at something, that's not only you as an individual, it only also reflects in the clan. This is probably one reason why Chinese, on one hand, are gamblers, but maybe this has something to do with why they don't think about luck per se. If they go to Vegas, they want to make a lot of money, but they also want to be able to go back and say, oh, our family's so lucky. Look at how well I did. So you spin this as a family thing. Americans want to win a lottery. They want to have a lot of money so they can go and, turn into a couch potato for the next 30 years of their lives. Um, so winning is everything in China. And you always have to remember whenever you're dealing with anyone, especially in a business setting, but even in Chinese Communist Party, if you're dealing with CCP members, you have to remember they view the other folks in the CCP the same way. So they'll cheerfully backstab and squeal on each other at a moment's notice, if that's going to get them ahead. So this probably goes back to the reason why Guanxi is so important. If you're in the social relationships, if you owe people favors, you're not going to screw them over, or the chances are hugely less it's going to happen. So this is probably one reason why Guanxi is so central. That's the only package of people outside of family that you have some minimal level of trust for. Everyone outside of that is like, it's the class. It's like I said, it's the classic, 1960s American Western. Everyone's walking around with their guns unlatched and ready to go. Oh, it's just a matter if you can get the first shot off. Now, last of these is sort of tied to this idea well, it's basically the idea of reputation. Power and authority in China means that a bunch of people are going to be groveling at your feet, trying to PR you, kiss your boots, and everything because they want to get in a Guanxi relationship. So people in China, I see this a lot in Hong Kong because I'm more familiar with that. People with authority and power in China tend to be very unshy about that. They tend to do things that would make, mafiosi in Chicago in the 1930s blush. So if you've got power, man, you play that puppy up for 120%. Not for the least, as we'll see as we get into logic and symbolism, is Chinese have a very strong sense that what goes up must come down. So the strong in China, there's a huge logic that if you are powerful, that's a temporary state of affairs. It's not going to be permanent. It's going to be temporary. So you better enjoy it on the way up because sooner or later you're going to be on the way down. It's going to be absolutely no one shedding any tears when that happens. So if you've got power and authority, boy, you play that card every chance you get. Now, what you have as sort of a counterbalance to that is what translates into English from Chinese is rectification of name. If you're theoretically, hypothetically, if you're in a position of authority or power, whether it be in a company, whether it be in a family as the senior member of the family, whether it be in the Communist Party, whatever it is, the fact that you have that title and you have the prestige and power attached to it means that in some way, shape, or form, you're supposed to perform to the job description of that position. So if you're a judge, you're supposed to be a good judge and a upright judge and follow the rules because that's what the prestige of being a judge is. It means that you're supposed to do that. If you would, that's your job description, rectification name, job description. And so on one hand, you have power and authority. You can scare people, threaten people. On the other hand, there's this idea that you have to perform the job description to earn and keep that power and authority. Now, having said that, I've never quite figured out if this actually, I know people are like this. So it's not that it doesn't exist. I'm not sure how widespread it is, but as a moral social scorecard, it's huge. And one of the things you'll see in terms of positive spin or positive gossip would be that someone is such a good example of rectification of name for their, whatever it is they do. Chinese historical dramas, the Judge D mysteries, Justice Bao, both judges in different periods, the first in the Tang, second in the Song Dynasty, are really famous, and you still see their TV shows and movies all the time. And the reason is they're personifications of individuals who, despite whatever the temptation was, always performed their job description. They always did rectification of name. Justice Bao probably the most because the Sung Dynasty was famous for corruption. And through Chinese, Chinese history, I think it dates from the 1100s, something like that. He's been the role model for following the job description, i.e., rectification of name, despite the temptations of power and authority and everything else that could happen that you could get very easily, given the authority you had. So, then this also becomes then something you want kids to learn because these folks are still famous because they did do this. So they become the role models for, if you want to be a good person, this is how you should do it. Act like Judge D did, act like Justice Powell did. And the family will gain a lot of credit. And that's true. Families will. If someone in the family is famous for their rectification of name, the family will gain an enormous amount of social prestige and status by this. So there's a system of checks and balances. The key here is the realization that's all based on social evaluation, if you would, social credibility. The number of folks that are, your followers on your Instagram page, for example, it's not based on, certification or legal system or, whatever it might be in the United States. So it's a totally different package. And it's important to remember this plays 100% of the time. So if you're dealing with Asians, in this case, specifically Chinese, you have to always be aware, at least in the back of your mind, if not in the front of your mind, that what they're saying, if they don't know you, what they're saying and how they're doing stuff can be based on anything. They might be planning to be real nice to you because it's Wednesday. They may be planning to screw you over the first chance they get because it's Wednesday. There's no moral or ethical code because you're a stranger. If you're in balanced reciprocity, it's a very strict moral code. If you're in generalized reciprocity, it's even more strict because it's sort of like, everyone has to help everyone else out. So a totally different system. And again, not all that different than what you would see in Hawaii and traditional Hawaiian sites. Not the same. They're entirely different sites, but the logics are very similar. But very much in contrast to sort of the Anglo-American norm.